Madhav for making this possible. It's due to Madhav initiative that we have you here, Sam. So thank you, Madhav.
Yeah, thank you, Madhav.
Yeah.
You've been very kind to reach out. Okay, so yes, I feel very privileged to be here. It's very nice to speak to both battery people and AI people at the same time. Hopefully there is a mix of both in the audience. So I'm going to talk to you today about machine learning for advanced characterization and design of battery electrodes. My group is a bit broader than that in the sense that we do AI for other stuff than battery electrodes, but as we all know, batteries are very important right now, so there's lots of funding and kind of spaces opening up that allow you to do a lot of research in this space very easily, certainly in the UK. So what's going on inside a battery? I'm sure most of you in the audience know that it's a real mess inside. So you open it up and you zoom in. And so this is sort of an 18650, a classic cell of which there's 6,000 inside a Tesla Model S, or there used to be. And you look inside and it's this layered thing. It's all rolled up. It's called the jelly roll. And you look at one unit of this roll up and it's got an anode on one side, a separator, and then a cathode on the other side. And they're very different morphology all the way. And if you zoom in even further, what you can see is that there's lots of complexity all the way down. So there are relevant geometrical features all the way from meters at the scale of packs and cooling and thermal management and safety, all the way down to nanometers, and of course, really down to atoms in terms of how the surfaces behave. And so my group are interested in kind of all of the problems from sort of a millimeter downwards in particular, and particularly recently enjoying making renders of those types of objects. And so thinking about whether it's particle morphology, the distribution of CBD, how the microstructure evolves over time, how it should be structured in the first place, what the relationship between manufacturing and the final resulting microstructure might be, etc. And so the way we approach this is intended to be a design cycle, right? And so in the example of geometrical quantification, of course, there are many other relevant, very important metrics for batteries, but first step is to characterize, so see what's there. So to go from reality to some kind of representation. So in this case, going from some kind of, noisy tomography image to a segmented phase map of where's solid and where's pore, for example. And then using this information as the basis of a model. So can we put physics into this geometry and then get that to tell us what performance we would expect to see? And then ideally, we want to start working backwards and say, well, okay, if this structure gives us this performance, which structure would give us a better performance? And then the important step, all of this so far has just been fun for science, but the really important bit is to get all the way back to reality and say, okay, well, what is the improved structure that we can manufacture? So it's okay to say we want these infinitely thin particles that are nanofilaments or whatever, but what we really want to do is optimize it in a constrained way that is constrained for things that can be manufactured with the processes that we have. And that's what I'm going to talk to you about today. So all of those steps I'm going to talk to you about today. The first bit is just about imaging itself. So there's been a great deal of progress in terms of microstructural imaging of electrodes over the last 20 years. And yet still it's a real challenge. So these things have important features across a lot of length scales. And certainly the lab-based techniques, so the top row, are still quite coarse compared to some of the features involved. If you go to a synchrotron, you can get a bit better resolution, but actually the big white particles in the middle row, those are the active material particles. They're sort of 5, 10, 20 microns across. But the morphology of the carbon binder domain is much smaller than that and might be very important to performance. If you then, instead of X-rays, you use ions or electrons to image your sample, you come across an interesting problem, which is that some regions, once you've cut your sample in half using your focused ion beam or your laser, some regions are easy to identify. So this yellow region here is clearly a particle that's been cut through, and we can see it's all active material inside the yellow ring. Other regions are also somewhat clear. We can see that with a reasonable degree of confidence that this region is a kind of carbon binder piece of space, but other regions are a real mess. So what's going on inside the magenta ring here? Well, it could be some active, it could be some binder, but it's probably largely the back wall of a pore. And so this pore backs effect is sort of well known in the characterization of porous and composite materials. And so what can you do about it? And in the for example, in the SOFC area, one way to approach this would be to infiltrate all of your pores with epoxy resin before you do the imaging. And now the pores are full and you can't see the back walls. But there are two problems with this for batteries. One is that the battery electrodes aren't quite as rigid as the sintered ceramic scaffolds of SOFCs, so the epoxy might distort the microstructure. And another problem is that the epoxy might not go into all of these nano pores. It is a viscosity limited process. And the third problem is that even if it does, you then have to try and segment the difference between a carbony polymeric binder and a carbony epoxy resin that basically have a very similar signal under electrons or X-rays. So we've recently published what we believe to be a pretty neat solution to this, which is to prepare your sample as you usually would in the focused ion beam. So you can see an image C, which is a nice cross-section of a electrode that's been coated on both sides of a current collector. But then to do something slightly strange, then to recoat the face that you've just exposed for imaging, coat that face in platinum all over again. Sorry, coat that face in platinum. So cover up the whole face in platinum and ideally try and fill in the pores. So cover it in quite a lot of platinum. And when I say a lot, I mean sort of nanograms, but still a lot in this length scale. The next step is to polish that platinum away again back to where you were before. And what you're left with, once you do a very fine polish, is that all of the back walls of pores are now coated with platinum and show a very strong contrast, whether it's in backscattered or secondary electrons. And this is somewhat reminiscent of the image is somewhat reminiscent of the Japanese art of kintsugi, which means golden joinery, a way of repairing broken ceramics with precious metal amalgams. And so that's one way to improve the contrast in these images and make phase identification easier. There's another trick that we employed in the same paper, which is about trying to improve the actual segmentation using convolutional methods. So nothing particularly novel here, but it is novel in the context of this particular application. So when collecting these images, if you can, leave as many detectors on as possible. Most machines will have at least 2 different detectors. So what we did is we got a very nice, clean, sharp secondary electron image, and we also got a rather noisier, but significantly different signal structure backscattered image. So you can see if you look at the red ring around that feature there, it's clearly a hole that we haven't managed to totally fill with platinum. The in-lens backscattered detector sees the back wall of that thing very easily. So what we do is we use multi-channel convolutional segmentation methods. So just pass this thing in as a image with 2 channels, and then apply segmentation based on convolutions of those 2 channels. So here we go. Here's an overlay of the resulting segmentation. And then here's just the material on its own, now showing, I think, clearer than anywhere I've seen in the literature, the distribution of the 3 phases, including cracks in the particles of active material. And some of those cracks are, of course, empty, and some of the cracks are full. And this has implications for what you expect the performance to be based on your simulations. You can confirm this result in terms of the distribution of phases fairly convincingly with EDS. And that allows you to see, the nickel is where you'd expect the nickel to be, and the platinum is where you'd expect the platinum to be, etc. But also you can look at other signals, and here we've got a fluoride signal, and it shows that there's perhaps a greater amount of the PVDF binder towards the bottom of the electrode than towards the top, which may tell you something about, for example, the drying rate of your electrode during manufacture. And so that paper's recently come out in ECS, and for any of you who do FIB-SEM microscopy, this is just such an easy fix. You can immediately apply this to your samples without sort of learning any particular extra skills. You just recoat the face with platinum and polish it away again, and now all of your pores glow, which is rather attractive as well. So we've got a team of people in my group working on these convolutional segmentation methods, and what's quite fun is that, of course, the entire self-driving car industry and many other industries besides have built hugely powerful, data processing workflows in things like, TensorFlow and PyTorch in order to solve this problem for already defined industrial applications or for generating and detecting pictures of cats on Facebook. And we are basically just making use of these to do this work with batteries. And so trying to work out user-efficient human-in-the-loop convolutional methods. So each data set the human has, you then give it a few areas that you want to label as particular phases, and it uses those to train a network, a multi-channel convolutional network, in order to try and get as good a segmentation as you were hoping for in that time. Once you have a microstructural data set, so once you've got your 3 different phases in the case of a battery cathode, so that's the active material where the lithiums intercalate in and out, your carbon binder domain, which holds the whole thing together and also transports electrons, and your pores, which is where the ions travel through in the electrolyte. Once you've got that map, you can then feed that to a solver software package that we've released open source called Tau Factor, which will extract for you key relevant battery microstructural metrics. So whether that's simple things like volume fractions and surface areas, or slightly more elaborate things like the pore phase tortuosity factor or the solid phase electronic conductivity, this is now a sort of GPU accelerated solver package that can get you these metrics very fast indeed. And so we released that a long time ago, about 7 years ago, but we're just about to submit the GPU accelerated update, which is about 2 orders of magnitude faster, which is a big speed up. So that's sort of the basics of characterization within our group. And what I mostly want to talk about today is the work that we're doing with more recent, slightly more unusual flavors of AI from a battery world perspective, right? I appreciate GANs, these generative adversarial networks, have been done to death in the machine learning space, but in the battery world, they're relatively unheard of or unseen. So we published a paper 2 years ago, Pause for Thought, which basically does this. So if you've got a microstructural training set derived from perhaps some tomographic data, you can use this to train a GAN. So a GAN is basically 2 neural networks that play a game against each other in order to train. And the game is this. One of your networks is a classic discriminator. So it looks at your training set, it looks at some examples of the data, and it tries to give it a score between 0 and 1 about how real it is. And if it's real, it'll try to give it a score of 1, and if it's fake, it'll try to give it a score of 0. And this is just using a multi-layer convolutional approach to doing this. The image looks like it's looking at 2D data, it's actually working in 3D, but I've got a direction that I'm using to convey in the information direction, and that would require a 4D sketch to show that as well. So it's really a 3D discriminator using 3D convolutions. Now that's a very well understood object. That's just a classic neural net. It just allows you to detect things in an image or make a guess about an entire image. The clever bit with GANs is to then have a network of roughly the inverse structure. So now this one goes from very small to very large, and it takes in a sort of random seed or a sort of latent vector and uses this to generate an example of an instance of microstructural data. And what it's trying to do is trick the discriminator into thinking that what it's made was also a member of the training set. So was also a member of the same distribution underpinning the training set. And so if the discriminator guesses correctly, this one, oh, I think that one's fake, then that information is propagated backwards into the generator because the whole system is differentiable in order to update all the weights and to make it give a better approximation next time. So you are basically whispering in the ear of both the discriminator and the generator each time that they look at some data to say, here's how you can improve next time. What that means is that once you've trained it successfully, your generator is now a machine that will generate arbitrarily large instances of microstructure that have all the same statistics as your training set. And so this can be very convenient for a few reasons. So one, the arbitrarily large point is quite handy. So here is a GAN generated cathode data set, and it is larger than any data set that has ever or possibly will ever be collected from a cathode. And it's, this is just a 2D slice, but it's 3D. And it's got some really interesting properties as well. We can force the generated objects themselves to have periodic boundaries. So imagine that a particle that finishes on the left-hand side also re-emerges on the right-hand side of the image. That's actually quite straightforward to do with a generator. It's the way that you offer it the seeds as it starts the generation process. But of course, in the real world, you would not expect a particle that goes off the edge of one side of your volumes that you generate for your physics-based 3D simulations can be smaller, because the error incurred from your mirror boundaries on these planes at the edges of your domain are causing less of an error, which is a really neat little property. We followed that paper up with an even neater trick, in my view, which is that actually it turns out you don't need 3D data to generate 3D data. So you can actually just have your discriminator look at two-dimensional slices, and your generator still generates three-dimensional volumes. But once it's generated that three-dimensional volume, it's chopped up into lots of slices. So in all three directions, your data set is chopped up into, n slices, where n is the number of voxels along one dimension. And so you've got 3n two-dimensional slices, and your discriminator looks at all of those in order to work out whether it thinks the whole 3D generation was real or not. And it turns out if you do that, you can generate beautifully high-quality three-dimensional volumes just from two-dimensional data. And we think this has got some really important implications. There's a lot of neat maths in granular media that shows you that actually all the information that you'd need to know about a macro-homogeneous material will be present in a large enough two-dimensional image. And this means that we can use methods like the kintsugi method I showed you earlier with the platinum deposition, and just collect very large regions very quickly compared to sort of setting up a computed tomography scan, and then use that as the basis of generating 3D volumes using SliceGAN, which is what we call the algorithm. And it works for a wide range of materials, whether that's sort of dispersed particles in space, or you can even have the system be anisotropic. So
a product which has its own
hello. You can even have it learn anisotropic materials, but it requires you to give it different orientations of data from the image to begin with, and also interesting things like EBSD data. So it doesn't have to be black and white. It can be also color channels representing crystal orientations. And if you compare the two approaches, actually they perform almost identically, but SliceGAN seems to perform rather better in many cases. And we think that's something to do with the fact that the discriminator and the generator, by having the different architecture that they do, the discriminator is 2D and the generator is 3D, they have fewer means of cheating. And if anyone has trained a GAN before, they often find ways of cheating, which can be, is often called model collapse. And it means that your generator has found a way to trick your discriminator into thinking that your generated instances are part of the training set, when really they're just found some like hack in the system. An example of which is it can exactly copy the elements of the training set that you have, although that's rarely what's actually happening. So it seems that SliceGAN actually is 2D to 3D works even better than 3D to 3D for a range of interesting reasons. So using some of the same technology, we've recently just submitted a paper on Inpainting. So you often have data sets where small regions of your data are damaged. Perhaps that's because you've got some charging artifacts, or literally your machine cut out briefly while you're collecting a very large experimental run. And we can use a GAN to highlight that region and fill it in with data that has all the same statistics as the data in all of the surrounding regions. So rather than having to throw away that very large data set because of a very small defect, you can then fill in that defect and use the data set still as a simulation domain. We have taken these tools and built a nice pipeline connecting it to a microstructural database called DoItPoms, which is something come out of Cambridge. And they've just got lots and lots of beautiful, usually SEM images of a wide variety of materials with lots of nice metadata. And you can see here for micrograph 14, it's some kind of steel, and it's labeled with austenite, carbon, cementite, etc. What we've done is build a pipeline that takes that data, does a bit of cleaning first. So for some sad reason, all of this data has had scale bars drawn on top of it in what appears to be Microsoft Paint, perhaps, or maybe PowerPoint. And so first thing, we've got to remove that, because some of these scale bars plus texts are filling up 10% or 20% of all of the usable training data from the image. So we can segment the image, find out where the scale bar is automatically, and then use our Inpainter to make that scale bar disappear. And now we've got a significantly larger amount of data in which we can use as training for SliceGAN. And then we take that data and we make 3D realizations of the 2D images that were in the database. And then we've built a pipeline so it does it for all of them. And it's taken all of those data sets and just turned them into these 3D volumes from which you can then extract all these metrics of interest, particularly things like tortuosity factors, which give you insight into thermal transport properties, ion diffusion, electronic conductivity, etc. And we've made that into a website, microlib.io, which is live now. And we recently had that paper accepted into Nature Scientific Data, which is very nice. So you can see, hopefully, there's this common thread of GANs, and we are now, like I suspect many other GANs people, having a look at diffusion and seeing if we can do the things we've done better. But we do really like GANs. And our most recent paper to be accepted is this one. So image data fusion. What if, which is the case, it's easy or relatively easy to collect very high resolution, two-dimensional data that can identify all three of the phases, for example, using kintsugi in a battery cathode. And you're also able to collect comparatively low data, but it is a nice 3D volume. So it's quite a large field of view. It's three-dimensional. And there's another downside of the X-ray data for battery electrodes, which is that essentially the carbon binder domain is invisible, right? And I think there's quite a lot of X-ray papers where they talk as if they can see the carbon binder domain, but they very rarely actually publish the raw projections and, the raw reconstructions. And this I don't feel to be the case. I've never seen an X-ray paper where carbon binder domain is convincingly resolved. However, you do in principle have all the information that you'd like. So we have developed a data fusion technique that combines super resolution, style transfer, and dimensionality expansion to combine these two different data types into a super resolved data set, which is the image on the right-hand side. So on the bottom row, on the left-hand side is an arbitrary region of our high-resolution segmented 2D data set. On the bottom row in the middle is a particular region of the low-resolution 3D two-phase data set, and on the bottom right is the super resolved or the data fused region shown on the left. So this exact region, once you've applied a GAN that's been trained on this high resolution data, will turn this thing into this thing here. And in our case, we had the ground truth available to us. So we'd sort of start with the high res, make the two different versions of the data, training data, and then we try and reconstruct this high resolution training set. And it gives you beautiful statistics. So for these three metrics, so we've got volume fractions, surface areas, and transport efficiencies, which is 1 over, the porosity divided by the tortuosity factor. And in each case, our super res algorithm, by combining this high res and low res data, was able to really convincingly reproduce the not just the average behavior, but the distribution of behavior, so the heterogeneity within the structure of our ground truth, which is pretty exciting. This again works for anisotropic materials. So here is some battery separated data. So on the left, we've got two images, top left, we've got two images of high resolution that show these sort of nanofibrils, so these very fine filaments that connect the thicker lamellar regions of the separator. And then in the middle, we've got a coarse three-dimensional XCT image of a battery separator. And we're once again using our algorithm to combine them into this super resolved 3D volume. And again, if you look in the bottom row, the left side is an arbitrary region of the high res. The middle is a particular region of the low res 3D. And the right hand side is that same region again, once super res has been applied to it. Okay, and lastly, the third case study that we showed in the paper was about using this for SOFC anode materials. So this is pore, ceramic, nickel. And we did the same thing again, and it works, even for these sort of strange regions. We kept this one, we picked a sample at random, and initially we thought, well, that's a very strange region. Is this the right way to illustrate it? But actually, the answer is yes. The global statistics are all correct. The sort of violin plots show that undeniably. And even for these slightly strange regions with large particles, you still end up getting a very convincing reconstruction. So that's very satisfying. The final example we gave in the paper is where we don't have a ground truth. So those three, we all started with the high-res 3D 3-phase. But with this one, it's just two data sets from NREL. So one is an SEM image of the carbon binder domain, pore, and active material. Another is a XCT image of just the active material where the CBD is invisible. And then we've super resolved it. And you end up seeing some really interesting sort of large features as well as these very tiny features in the way that the CBD ends up being distributed next to the active materials, which reflects what's observed in the high resolution SEM data. So to give you a real sense close up of what's happening, if I let this run, this is a super resolution of the data, right? So what you had was the underlying low res 2-phase data, and I've now super resolved it, and it's got these 3 phases with the details, but I'm still passing my generator, the generator of my GAN, not just the low res information as a map, but also some random noise. There is still a random seed, this latent vector, which means that for any given low res image, there are many different instances. There are many different incarnations of the high-res version that it could generate. And so if you look in the green ring here, the underlying low-res was exactly the same in both cases, but it does give you these different morphological features, and they are observable, but the macroscopic statistics are all correct. So the sort of heat transfer or ion transport or electronic conductivity are all the same once you have a representative volume. I can give you another incarnation that will fade slowly across, and you can see that like lots and lots of things change, including the boundaries of the gray particles, but all of it still looks right, and all of it has the same statistics as you would want it to have. So I've shown you a set of tools going from characterization through material characterization directly with kintsugi and multi-channel convolutional segmentation, through to generation with the pause for thought GAN, generation from 2D to 3D, and then finally the super resolution where you're both combining the 2D and 3D images from different machines. What to do with all that? This is all, at that stage, you're still just sort of characterizing and simulating. What we would really like is to go from a desired battery performance metric of some kind, so some kind of duty cycle, for example, put it into our magical machine, our magical algorithm, and what it would give us are optimized battery manufacturing parameters. So you can go back to the factory and say, here is how you mix this together, here's how you press it, here's how long you dry it for, etc., etc. But clearly, to do that, our magical algorithm is going to have learned all of the constraints of the system. So it's going to have learned what materials are available. It's going to have learned what all the different processing steps can possibly do. Otherwise, it's going to give you unhelpful suggestions in the optimization. So this is hard because it's going to require a very large amount of training data. The model itself, in principle, might be very large and therefore very expensive to train. And even once you've done that, how you'd go about justifying your predictions is a standing machine learning problem in general. So explainable AI is a real challenge. In this case, how would you go about saying why you should use those particular manufacturing properties other than it has made this prediction? And actually, each time that you've got a new process or chemistry or geometry or machine, you might need to retrain the entire thing because it's not clear how you can break it down into particular pieces that you can then train just that piece. The way that we are approaching this is to break it down into a modular system. So rather than trying to do, deep manufacture where we learn the entire relationship between every stage at once, what we do instead is the following. We train a conditional GAN, a SliceGAN, and a conditional GAN, unlike the original one, which just learns one type of battery microstructure, a conditional GAN can learn a family of different structures, where each time you also give it a little piece of information about which member of the family it's currently looking at. So I can say to it, okay, have a look at this piece of microstructural image data. And I'm telling you, it was made like this, specified in a few parameters. And so it learns the relationship not just between generating microstructures in general, but generating microstructures of a particular specification, which you specify with manufacturing parameters. Once you have generated a microstructure from a particular manufacturing setup, we can then pass this to our tau factor simulation suite, and it will then extract all of the relevant battery metrics, battery performance metrics, so volume fraction, surface area, tortuosity, and conductivity. And we can pass all of those to a battery simulation, so a classic P2D, Doyle-Fuller-Newman type model, which will then give us a prediction about the expected capacity of the cell under a particular condition. So we might be interested in sort of an energy cell where we want to store lots of energy, but we don't mind about doing it at low power, or a power cell, or we've got a particular drive cycle in mind that we'd like it to perform well on. We can ask it any question we want in the load cycle space. We then pass the results of that. So, how long did it last, or how much energy did it store at this particular rate? We can pass that information to an optimizer, and we've chosen to use Bayesian optimization because it seems to work rather efficiently in these high dimensional spaces. And the optimizer will do what Bayesian optimization does, which is start to build a map of predicted, in this case, capacity of your battery, also have a corresponding map of where it's least certain about its predictions, and then use that to define an acquisition function that says, okay, the next best place to look is here if you're trying to optimize this system. And it passes the here, which is new manufacturing conditions, back to the generator, and the generator makes new examples of microstructure, and around we go. So this data that I'm showing you here is from simulated battery manufacture, because we want to talk about the theory piece first. But of course, we can train it using the same kintsugi data that I showed you earlier, which is exactly what we've been doing. So this little GIF here is showing you our ability to move through the space of possible battery microstructures. And so we're moving first through a sort of CBD to CBD adhesion metric, and then through a volume fraction of active material metric. And we can do this fast enough that we can make a video of it. Now, that doesn't necessarily tell you anything because I didn't tell you how long it took to render the video. But the point is this: the sort of state-of-the-art battery manufacturing simulations, if you're going to simulate mixing, and you're going to simulate coating, and you're going to simulate drying, and you're going to simulate calendaring, these are extremely challenging simulations. And they tend to take on the order of many days on very large supercomputers to generate one, in my view, often not representative volume of some microstructure. Our GAN can look at image data, and once you've trained it on a normal office workstation for a few hours, it can then generate instances for you in a fraction of a second. So we've got sort of 4 orders of magnitude speed up in our ability to generate and therefore explore the space of possible electrodes in this optimization cycle. That is, we think, a bit of a game changer in terms of, there are so many parameters that you might want to change when you're manufacturing battery electrodes. And so exploring that space is very important if you don't want to waste a lot of time in your factory. And so we have now got this design cycle where the slowest part for us is now the metric extraction. So even though that's been sped up by 3 orders of magnitude in our GPU accelerated tau factor, it still takes a few seconds to characterize a particular microstructure, which is what's slowing us down right now. So with that, I would like to conclude and leave apparently lots of time for questions. But that is a sort of quite speedy workflow through the work that we're doing at Imperial that is combining AI and batteries, which I think was my brief. Of course, this image combines people from 5, I think, different groups in Imperial. There are, I think, something like 200 battery researchers at Imperial, so a very large number of people working on this. And most of them are working at either building different types of cells or cell level testing or working on the chemistry. But there's this bit in the middle, which is where my group tends to occupy its time, thinking about the relationship between manufacturing parameters and the resulting geometry and the resulting cell performance, that I think is really ripe for a lot of these artificial intelligence tools. And we are using tools or often similar tools like GANs in a wide variety of ways in order to really accelerate and augment the results that we're seeing. So with that, thank you very much for your attention, and I'd be absolutely delighted to take any questions.